a husband and father tragically takes his own life.
The victim still had a .22 caliber revolver in his hands.
Maybe he just had enough of the pain, you know?
But an unexpected confession reveals there's much more to the story.
No, this is not what I saw.
And it's up to Kenda and his team to uncover a cache of secrets and lies.
I knew that Charlie was having an affair.
She burns through that $10,000 just in a few months.
Is this something that could push somebody over their edge to commit murder? You bet it is.
Families appear a certain way to casual acquaintances. They were the nicest people. They were quiet, but you never, ever know what goes on in a private home when the doors are closed and the lights are out.
It's a busy summer night for Colorado Springs. EMTs Mark McDonald and Mark Bruning on the city's east side.
Once we got there, the PD were already on scene, and so our part of our job was to go in and actually assess the patient.
Where's the patient?
He's in the master bedroom.
All right.
It's kind of surreal, to tell you the truth, because you're thrown immediately into this chaotic scene.
Up here, up here.
When we first walked into the room, there was a gentleman with a obvious gunshot wound.
Everything's gonna be okay.
But it was pretty well obvious at that time that this gentleman was deceased.
Nothing.
Sergeant Joe Kenda is already waist deep in an unrelated investigation.
Did the suspect make a statement?
No, not yet. But he had a bloody knife on him. I think it's a murder weapon.
It's after 2 o'clock in the morning and I'm at the scene of a homicide. Crime never sleeps, crime never takes a day off, and everybody seems to like the cover of darkness.
The coroner's on his way. Great.
Dispatch to 4-1. 118 back in the car.
Go for 4-1.
We have a report of a shooting near Palmer Park. First responders are saying they believe it's self-inflicted.
The initial report was this is probably a suicide, and I decided to remain at my current crime scene and send one of my detectives and report back to me.
Within the hour, Kenda has dispatched one of his detectives to the residence near Palmer Park.
Good evening, Detective.
Hey, what do we got here?
39-year-old male, single gunshot wound to the head. Appears to be self-inflicted.
Victim, he is now disconnected.
They had identified him as an individual named Charlie Tuttle, who actually worked for the city of Colorado Springs in the electric division.
Before I met Charlie, he was a staff sergeant in the Air Force, and he worked in electronics, repairing and calibrating flight simulators. He's a very honest and trustworthy person.
Looks like the wife, stepdaughter, and a neighbor discovered him in the bedroom. We cut the neighbors loose. He didn't know anything.
Okay. Now where's the body?
Upstairs in the bedroom.
Lead the way.
In the master bedroom, Mr. Tuttle is laying face down on the bed.
The family found him like this?
Yes, sir.
Upon initial examination of the scene, detectives noted that, in fact, the victim still had a .22 caliber in his hands.
And there was a single entry gunshot wound to the back of the head, and there is no exit.
What an odd way to shoot yourself.
Most gun suicides, the person is sitting erect and the gun is fired into the temple. It's extremely uncommon to see someone lie on their stomachs and shoot themselves in the back.
Anyone touch that shotgun?
No, it was positioned there when we arrived.
And this particular shotgun had string wrapped around the trigger.
Now that is indicative of someone trying to rig a weapon so they can cause it to discharge by aiming at themselves. He rigs this gun and then apparently changes his mind. And decides to use a handgun instead.
As investigators examine the rest of the bedroom, the evidence continues to line up with that theory.
It looks like somebody kicked the door in.
This is the only entry into the room.
There's a shoe print on the door next to the door handle assembly.
Witnesses claim that they broke the door.
Pressed and actually locked himself in the bedroom, climbed into bed, and shot himself. That's a pretty good possibility at this point.
To confirm that possibility, investigators need to see if witnesses' stories lead to the same conclusion.
Well, let's go talk to the family. If he killed himself, maybe they can tell us why.
They then speak to the wife of the victim, whose name is Jackie Tuttle. She's 42 years of age.
Mrs. Tuttle, I am so sorry for your loss. Do you mind answering a few questions?
Jackie is kind of quiet, soft-spoken. She worked for a real estate company, and she had been married to Charles for about 14 years. He was actually her second husband.
Do you and Charlie have any kids together?
No. I have 2 grown children from my first marriage. My older daughter, Jennifer, she lives back in Texas with her father. And Sarah, she lives here with us, and she was here tonight.
She says the evening progressed in a normal manner, except for the fact that Charlie was drinking heavily during dinner.
Now, how much alcohol did Charlie consume?
I don't know, like 10 beers.
Reports to the officers that her husband seemed to be very distressed after dinner and continued to drink and said he was going to bed.
So around midnight, Sarah and I went down and put a movie in downstairs. That's when we heard the gunshot. I'm sorry. I can't breathe. I can't.
It's okay. Thank you.
And that's when she became so distressed and she could not continue conversing with the officers because of her emotional state.
Hoping to learn why Charlie was distressed, investigators turned to Jackie's daughter, 19-year-old Sarah Reynolds.
Excuse me, Sarah. Do you have a moment to answer a few questions?
They ask her to describe the events of the evening, separate from her mother, and she tells precisely the same story.
So after dinner, Charlie went to bed, and Mom and I watched a movie in the living room.
Please be with me. Be with me, please.
Heard a loud bang.
What was that? We went upstairs, but his door was locked. We tried to force the door to open, but it wouldn't budge.
And her mother said, "Go get the neighbor, he can help us." And she did that.
The neighbor came over and kicked the door in, and that's when we found him on the bed.
Now, I know this is difficult, Sarah, but can you think of any reason that Charlie may have wanted to end his life?
Yeah. He was just so different since the accident.
About a year earlier, he'd been in a very serious car accident.
Come here, honey. Come here, let me help you. Please, here, let's get this out of the way.
He was struck from behind by another car. It injured Charlie's neck and caused him pain in his neck and upper back.
His personality changed after that. He was so down about everything, constantly called out of work.
He became more depressed. He drank more. Now, all of that put together certainly sounds like someone who may be willing.
Complaining that his neck hurt. Maybe he just had enough of the pain, you know?
Yeah. Once again, I'm truly sorry for your loss.
Hours later, Sergeant Kenda requests a status report on Charlie Tuttle's case.
We found it odd that he shot himself in the back of the head, but all of the evidence that we found at the scene is consistent with suicide.
So what's the coroner think?
Oh, here's the report.
By law, the coroner determines the method of death and the manner.
Okay, thank you.
The coroner's office is fully informed of the details about Charlie's recent history and his motor vehicle accident and his depression, and the coroner rules it as a suicide, and the matter is closed, or so everyone thought.
6 months later, an unexpected visitor shows up at CSPD.
Sarah Reynolds? All right, have a seat. Someone will be with you in just a moment.
Thank you.
When someone comes into police headquarters and asks to speak to someone in homicide, they are directed to a supervisor, which in that case was me.
Hi, I'm Sergeant Kenda. Is there something I can help you with?
And was somewhat quiet.
The body language suggests that maybe she just wants to leave and is sorry she came in here.
It's all right. Anything you need to tell us, it'll be okay.
Well, my stepfather, Charlie Tuttle, he died 6 months ago in our house.
Okay.
And she looked at me and she said, well, I told a story to the policeman about how my stepdad killed himself.
But I was lying.
Oh my. Well, this is getting interesting. A 39-year-old man named Charlie Tuttle is believed to have shot himself in the privacy of his locked bedroom. Now it's 6 months later, and a young lady has come forward to say she lied, that none of what she said to the police was true.
Okay, why don't you just start from the beginning?
So, the night he died, I helped my mom make dinner. What's all this?
Something special for Charlie.
Jackie had actually picked up a bottle of Crown Royal whiskey, some cigars, and a fishing magazine.
Wow, Mom.
Right?
And Sarah thought that was kind of unusual because Jackie and Charlie had been arguing quite a bit lately.
And she suspected the marriage was coming to an end.
I thought it was her way of showing him she still loved him and wanted to make things work. And then when Charlie came home, he was in such a good mood.
Oh, wow. It's not my birthday.
No?
Oh, are you making your famous meatballs?
She said he was quite surprised and happy to see them fixing a nice meal for dinner.
And when we sat down to dinner, Mom and Charlie were reminiscing about old times.
This looks great.
Thank you.
Oh. Does the sauce taste funny to you?
No, I think it's fine.
I think the horseradish went bad. Eesh.
He didn't care for the shrimp cocktail, but he certainly ate everything else.
Could you pass me that garlic bread, please?
We had a really nice evening. And then Mom wanted to watch a movie. But Charlie said he's going to bed to read his fishing mag.
Do you remember what time that was?
No, I just remember the movie started and I must have totally passed out.
And that struck me. I passed out? Why did you pass out? Were you drinking?
No, I just remember feeling so tired all of a sudden. I couldn't keep my eyes open. And then I woke up around 1:30.
The house was quiet. The movie was on pause.
Her mother, Jackie, wasn't there, and so she's sitting there on the couch. And she heard this loud boom from upstairs.
Mom?
Her mother is holding a green bath towel, and protruding from the bath towel is a gun.
Honey, I need you to stay calm.
But what did you do?
Honey, I did it for his own good.
According to Sarah, she says, you know that Charlie's been in a lot of pain, and if anybody asked you, he did it to himself.
Now, I need you to take this towel and put it in the basement. Naked.
And she puts the gun on the bed next to Charlie's hand, and then walks out and locks the door behind them and says, now go get the neighbor to force the door open. So I listened to Sarah's story, and I said, well, Sarah, I must ask you the obvious question.
All right, but this was 6 months ago. Why you just bring it to us now?
Because I was scared. My mom threatened to kill me if I said anything.
But she told him that I'm coming in to tell the truth because I have so much guilt.
I can't sleep. I have nightmares about it.
Do you have any idea why your mother wanted to kill Charlie?
Yeah, she's greedy.
She said he had a $49,000 insurance policy, and she wanted that money.
And she got it too.
Perhaps in her mother's mind, she had 49,000 reasons to kill Charlie.
So, you're going to reopen his case?
Okay.
Thank you.
You must take people seriously when they tell you a story. Do you trust what they say? Of course not. Let's explore your story. So my first step is to go to the coroner's office. I inform the coroner of the new development, and the coroner agrees to review the report.
So I looked over all the reports again. This is extremely unusual.
Indeed. So what do you think?
Well, I did notice one thing. The witnesses claimed that Mr. Tuttle had been drinking heavily, but that's not what we're seeing in his toxicology results.
The blood alcohol content of Charlie was 0.01. That is not even legally impaired, let alone drunk.
It is strange. Well, after looking through everything, are you still confident it's a suicide?
You know, there's nothing in the report that contradicts suicide, but it is odd that he shot himself in the back of the head.
Yeah, it's very uncommon.
And I vaguely remember there was something else I found fishy, but that was like 40 autopsies ago. I don't remember now. I'll read through my notes again and see if I can figure out what it is.
I appreciate it. Thanks, Doc.
With the coroner's report inconclusive, Kenda's gut tells him to keep digging.
Mr. Wade, I'm Sergeant Kenda. Thanks for meeting me.
Glad to help however I can.
So Joe took an unusual step, and that was to contact the funeral director who embalmed the body of Charlie.
I said, well, in my experience, I've seen over 100 gunshot wounds to the head from people who kill themselves.
There was something that just wasn't quite right about this one. I actually remember it quite well. Let's see what we got here. What was the cause of death?
Suicide. Gunshot to the back of the head.
Really? If you put a gun to your head, it is extremely difficult to get a 90-degree contact. You're up, you're down, you're this way, that way, left and right. The result is the entrance wound itself is not round. It's shaped differently.
And when I looked at the hole on the inside of the skull, that was much larger, but still symmetrical. Most of the time, you don't get a perfect 90-degree angle.
He said at that point in time, I was suspicious that this was in fact not a suicide, but he went on with the involvement anyway.
There's not much that surprises me in this business, but this one did.
Yeah, well, thank you. You've been very helpful.
So this evidence is adding up nicely to murder and not suicide.
Kenda and his team start by tracking down Charlie Tuttle's widow at her new home.
So we want to go see Jackie now because I've got a lot more information other than just Sarah's allegations. I know the physical evidence says that Charlie didn't shoot himself.
Do you guys take anything in your coffee?
No, just black, thank you.
I wouldn't mind some sugar if that's okay.
Sure.
The first thing we noticed is very sparse. Very little furniture, very neat, very clean.
Where are all the family photos?
There are no pictures of her husband, almost sterile, if you will.
It is very odd to have a personal home that contains no evidence of memorabilia of your family. So there's something already quite odd about Jackie.
So, what do you guys want to talk about?
Well, your daughter Sarah stopped into the precinct.
She did? Why?
We tell her, your daughter came to report that you killed your husband and swore her to secrecy.
She's lying. It's an absolute lie.
Now, Mrs. Tuttle, why would your daughter make up a story like that?
It's obvious. She wants more money.
And we looked at her and we said, excuse me, what do you mean by more?
Victim, he is now disconnected.
So we're investigating this suicide of Charlie Tuttle, which has now become a homicide based on the physical evidence and based on the fact that the daughter accuses the mother of having committed this murder.
And Jackie tells Joe, oh, she's lying. She only wants more money. Well, more money, what does that mean?
I guess the trouble started with Sarah when Charlie passed away.
She said there was a life insurance policy that was worth $49,000. I received the $49,000. I felt guilty about having all that money. And Sarah, who was a starving beauty college student, had no money.
I gave her 10 grand to finish school. I wanted to help her. I wanted her to get on her own 2 feet for once.
Sarah was the kind of kid where she'd never really had to go out and earn a living.
You know, I guess my daughter's a bit of a sponge.
So what's all this have to do with Sarah saying you killed your husband?
Like I said, she wanted more of Charlie's insurance money.
Jackie tells Joe that she burns through that $10,000 just in a few months. And she's already back asking for more with her hand out.
So she was threatening you for the money?
No, she doesn't threaten the insurance policy.
Like what?
She said, Sarah's been talking a lot about the insurance and who the beneficiary actually was. And Jackie felt that that was somewhat suspicious.
She says, I'm sure that Sarah believes if I get arrested for this and I go to prison, she'll wind up with the rest of the money.
While Kenda knows that life insurance payouts don't work that way, it's entirely possible that Sarah doesn't.
Well, thank you for talking to us, and thanks for the coffee.
Sure. You know, I hope this gets sorted out quickly, and I'm really sorry my daughter dragged you into this.
We'll let ourselves out.
We decide we're leaving. We have no intention of arresting Jackie at this point.
Well, that was interesting.
It sure was.
And all the way back to the car looking at each other like, how did we get involved in this?
Hey, when you get time, can you look into Tuttle's insurance policy?
Yeah, we'll do.
In the meantime, I'm going to find out more about Jackie and Sarah.
Good idea. I mean, even if Sarah is as greedy as Jackie says, would she really do that to her mom?
Right.
It's incredible that you find a family like this in a situation like this 6 months after the event. So how do you decide that the daughter is so vindictive and so evil that her mother didn't do? How does that work? Well, I don't know because I'm not crazy.
Hoping to learn more about Jackie and Sarah's relationship,
Barbara?
Kenda's team tracks down someone close to the family.
We discover a mutual friend whose name is Barbara Levitt.
I'm Detective Kenda.
What can I do for you, Detective?
So you're friends with Jackie Tuttle?
Yeah, I know Jackie. I've known her since 11th grade. back when we lived in Texas, almost 25 years. I didn't think I was that old.
I'm sure flies, don't it?
Do you know her daughters?
Oh, yeah, I've known Jennifer and Sarah since they were born.
So we have not just a friend, but a really good friend who should have some insight into these people.
So what can you tell us about Jackie and Charlie's relationship?
Jackie met Charlie in Texas. She was still married to Edward.
She was living in a very contentious relationship with her husband, wanted out of that, and she felt Charlie would be her way out.
So Jackie divorced Edward and married Charlie.
According to Barbara, Jackie followed her new husband all the way to Colorado Springs.
So what happened with the girls? Sarah and Jennifer, right?
Those poor girls. I mean, Sarah took it the hardest. She was only 3 or 4. She just didn't understand.
Barbara indicated that Sarah has resented her mother her entire life.
You know, here's somebody that's supposed to love you more than anything, and here she is not only leaving the family, but moving far away. She's basically abandoning you.
I think that's why Sarah's been a little bit of a troublemaker.
What do you mean?
You know, psychology. Sarah's childhood's warped her mind. She was always around conflict. You know, first her parents, then Jackie and Charlie.
Really? What'd they fight about?
Well, they fought about money. A lot of couples fight about money.
And I don't mean to speak ill of the dead, but...
She said, well, I knew that Charlie was having an affair.
An affair?
Yeah, he had a girlfriend. Jackie was devastated.
So Jackie leaves her husband and her 2 children for the love of her life. And now, the love of her life has a girlfriend. Now that's a motive for murder. So in this investigation of the death, there is an affair involved, which really puts the emotions on edge.
They had some pretty bad arguments over this woman. Charlie swore he wasn't cheating on her.
And why did Jackie think he was having an affair?
She says that she had found some notes between Charlie and this woman called Betsy. And so Jackie was convinced that he was going to leave her for Betsy.
Is this something that could push somebody over their edge to commit murder? You bet it is.
We've got to find somebody else now that may know about that. And we determined that Charlie had a best friend, and we want to know what that friend knows about the affair.
Excuse me, Hugh Hines?
Yes, sir.
I'm Sergeant Kender. We talked on the phone. Do you mind if I ask you a few questions?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Charlie and I worked together for nearly 7 years at the power station. He was an excellent mentor to me.
Can you tell me about Charlie?
He was very generous, very outgoing, real outdoorsman.
His passion was fishing. He really studied the subject, and he was.
Was he depressed about that?
No, I don't think so. He's depressed about his marriage.
We were close enough where we shared very personal information, and so I know that Jackie and Charlie were having difficulties in their relationship.
Was Charlie planning on leaving her?
Yeah, he was just trying to figure out how to get his retirement funds out first.
I'm not sure if these were exactly Charlie's words, but the message was that I have had it. I'm just taking my dog, my guns, and I'm going to Alaska.
Alaska?
Mm-hmm.
Was he going with someone?
No, Charlie just wanted to be alone.
We say, well, Hugh, we hear a story that maybe Charlie was having an affair with some woman named Betsy.
No way, man. He wasn't having an affair with Betsy.
Charlie and Betsy were friends. There was certainly no sexual relationship. Charlie never did anything except work and fish.
Charlie, as a matter of fact, had told Jackie that he was just fed up with her and he was going to move out and divorce her. Just because he wanted away from Jackie.
Well, I appreciate the help.
Absolutely.
So what do we do now? Charlie was apparently planning on leaving his wife and taking his money and going to Alaska. Instead, he winds up with a bullet in his head. All signs point to Jackie. What we need now is the proof.
Kenda decides it's time to go back to the very beginning.
I want to talk to the first person who entered that home after.
See ya. Come on, have a seat.
The neighbor who kicked down Charlie's door.
Thanks for coming in.
Sure. What can I help you with?
Can you walk me through what happened the night Charlie Tuttle died?
Okay. Well, I was sleeping and Sarah came over and woke me up. And she said Charlie hurt himself.
I was in a fog of sleep, waking up like, what? Basically, she just wanted me to come over and check it out.
He goes with her over to the house. Jackie's on her knees in the hallway, crying hysterically. He tries the door. It is, in fact, locked.
And then I think she encouraged me, can you break it in? I said, okay.
Charlie! No, stay here. Stay back. Stay back.
At that point, I smelled gun smoke. I could visually see a haze in the room.
And then I saw the blood and the gun. I ran downstairs and called 911.
It's burned in my brain, I would say. In my mind's eye, I can glimpse the metal of the gun, his head, and the blood.
I've got some crime scene photos. Would you mind taking a look at them?
Yeah. No, this is not what I saw.
That's not the way I found it. It was different in the photo than how I came upon the scene. I entered the bedroom. You could tell that there was somebody in the bed.
Charlie!
But the comforter was pulled all the way up.
Charlie!
Now, if you're going to shoot yourself, would you hide under a blanket to do it? No. But if you kill somebody and you don't want to look at them when they're dead and feel the guilt, you cover them up. Well, my. That's important.
Even with Eric Fillmore's statement, Kenda's case against Jackie Tuttle is weak. As he's pondering how to strengthen it, a possible solution surfaces.
Hey, Sarge, remember when you told me to check into Charlie's insurance policy? Mm-hmm. You're going to like this.
He confirmed that Jackie did receive $49,000 from the insurance company, paid her daughter Sarah $10,000, and they have bank deposits into Sarah's account of $10,000.
Okay, but Jackie already told us that.
Yeah, but what's strange is her other daughter, Jennifer, didn't get a penny.
Why would the mother give money to one daughter, not the other?
For your $10,000 investment. That's a reasonable conclusion.
Do we know where Sarah currently lives?
Yeah, I'll get your address.
Thanks.
So we go to find her, and we find that she's living with her grandmother, Debbie.
Thank you.
Can I get you anything else?
No, thank you. So, Sarah, the one thing that's been bothering us is why would your mother give you money from the life insurance and not your sister?
And Sarah was dumbstruck that we knew that. She just looked at us. She had nothing to say. Nothing.
I think it was to keep Sarah's mouth shut.
Grammy!
What do you mean with that?
Debbie went on to say that the day before the shooting took place, she had gotten a phone call from Jackie.
Hello?
Hey, Mom. Are you busy?
No, I just got home from work. What's going on?
Debbie is a nurse, and her daughter Jackie wanted to know if she combined a sleeping agent called Restoril with alcohol, would that make somebody really sleepy? Would it make them fall very, very soundly asleep?
Oh. Yeah, but you really shouldn't mix those. Why are you asking?
I'm just curious. Actually, Mom, I'm sorry, I gotta go. There's someone at the door.
Okay. Very odd phone call.
And when she made that comment to me, I'm thinking back to the story about the family dinner.
I just remember feeling so tired all of a sudden. I couldn't keep my eyes open.
That Charlie didn't eat the cocktail sauce because he thought it tasted funny.
Unusual way. On July 22nd, 1996, Kenda wonders, did Jackie mix Restoril into the cocktail sauce in order to put her victim and a potential eyewitness into a deep sleep?
Does Jackie have access to that drug?
Charlie's doctor prescribed it for him after his car accident to help him fall asleep easier.
Jackie, you thought you were going to walk, but you're not. Because we're going to walk over to your house and take you to jail. After this long, prolonged investigation, all the information we have learned adds up circumstantially to the guilt of Jackie Tuttle. We're going to place her in custody for the death of her husband.
Over the next couple hours, Kenda and his team hit the streets.
And they do find Jackie about 11:30 that night in a local watering hole.
What are you guys doing here?
Jackie, I have a warrant for your arrest for the murder of Charles Tuttle.
You can't be serious.
Cuff her.
Come with me.
Sarah is lying. She just wants the money.
And I looked at her and I said, well, Jackie, you have a problem.
Well, she wasn't the only one telling us that.
But I didn't do it.
That's not what the evidence says.
So we're going to take you in front of a jury of your peers and let them decide about your future. Come with us.
And Jackie got real silent and looked at Joe and said, I want a lawyer. She was then taken into custody, taken into county jail and booked.
Even without a confession, Kenda believes he knows what transpired.
In my opinion, based on what I've learned, I think that Jackie knew her husband was going to leave her.
Kenda theorizes that at that point, Jackie hatched a plan to figure insurance payout.
She asked her own mother, the nurse, how to devise some sort of drug to make him fall asleep.
But she also needed to drug her daughter so that she wouldn't be able to interfere with her plan.
This looks great. Huh. I think the horseradish went bad.
So she served the restaurant his favorite food, shrimp cocktail. But she didn't realize the drug would leave a weird taste in the sauce. And Charlie didn't eat anything that contained the drug, and that's why his toxicology screens came back negative.
However, Sarah finished her portion, and when she passed out on the couch, Jackie decided it was now or never.
Towel and a handgun. To her dismay, Jackie sees that Charlie has fallen asleep on his stomach and realizes it will be suspicious if he shoots himself in the back of the head.
Jackie knows if she tries to roll him over, he might wake up. Then how is she going to explain this gun in her hand?
And she realizes there is no turning back. And she points the gun at his head. And pulls the trigger.
And then she went to work, staging the bedroom to look like a suicide.
Everything about this crime scene, it's not a spontaneous thing. She thought about it and carried it out.
Jackie Tuttle is not charged with any crime.
Unfortunately, you never can predict what's going to happen during the trial. And Jackie's mother took the stand and recanted a lot of the information that she had given before.
In the court, you need proof beyond a reasonable doubt. So now the jury is left with making a decision. Who's lying? Everybody's lying. And they found Jackie not guilty of first-degree murder. Charlie went to his grave, and nobody paid the price. It's the reality of the court system. You're innocent until you're proven guilty.
In my opinion, I don't believe Charlie killed himself. I think it was a wrong decision on their part. I think she got away with killing Charlie.
It's just interesting how some.
There are mornings that begin with ordinary things. A car being washed in a driveway. A family moving through the rooms of a house. Clothes being prepared. Food being arranged. Relatives arriving from out of town. Children running through a home that is busier than usual because something important is about to happen. In Vernon, British Columbia, Friday, April 5th, 1996, was supposed to be one of those mornings. The Gacall family had spent years building a life in this quiet Okanagan community, and over more than 2 decades they had made Vernon their home. Their children had grown up there. Their lives had become intertwined with the rhythms of the town, with school, work, neighbors, community gatherings, and the traditions that connected them to the culture their parents had carried across an ocean. And now, inside their home on Mission Hill, the family was preparing for a wedding. There was a bride. There was a groom on his way. There were relatives arriving from distant places. There were children in the house. There was a grandmother. There were plans for the hours ahead, for photographs, for food, for greetings, for the celebration that was supposed to bring people together. No one inside that house could know that they were standing only minutes away from one of the deadliest acts of family violence Canada had ever seen. At approximately 10:30 that morning, a vehicle approached the house. Inside was 30-year-old Mark Vijay Chahal. He was not a stranger to the family. He was not an unknown intruder whose face nobody had ever seen. He was Rajwar Gacall's estranged husband, and that distinction would become one of the most haunting facts of the entire case. Because the danger did not arrive from some distant, anonymous place. It came from a relationship that had already broken down. It came from a man whose name was already familiar to the woman he would target. It came after warnings had already been made, because they believed they were preparing for happiness. Outside the house, Karnail Singh Gacall, 50 years old, was washing his car. It was an ordinary act, almost painfully ordinary in retrospect. He was a father, a husband, a man who had spent years working and raising his family in Canada. His daughter was preparing to marry, and the house behind him was filled with the people he loved. For a moment, nothing seemed wrong. Then Mark Chahal got out of the vehicle. He was carrying 2 handguns. One was a .40 caliber semi-automatic pistol. The other was a revolver. And as he moved toward the house, the morning changed forever. Karnail was the first person he shot. The attack had begun. A neighbor, Rick Young, would later describe seeing Chahal with a gun in each hand. The image was so shocking that it remained fixed in the witness's memory. A man standing only yards away, armed in both hands, moving through a family neighborhood as though the people around him no longer mattered. Chahal then turned toward the house. The windows became targets. Shots tore into the home. Inside were people who had gathered for a wedding. Some may not even have understood what was happening at first. Then the gunfire moved from the outside to the inside. The house became a maze of rooms, doorways, frightened people, and gunfire. Chahal moved through it. He was not looking for a single individual and stopping when he found them. He was going after the family. Rajwar was there. Her parents were there. Her brothers and sisters were there. The bride-to-be was there. Other relatives had come to share in the wedding preparations. Children were there. And within minutes, 9 members of the Gacall and Saran families would be dead. The entire shooting was over with astonishing speed. Only a few minutes. A lifetime of memories erased in the span of minutes. The family home, which should have been filled with anticipation for a wedding, became the scene of a massacre. 6 victims were dead by the time police arrived. 3 others would later die in hospital from their wounds. 2 people survived their injuries, including a 6-year-old girl. Other children escaped physical injury. But surviving the bullets did not mean escaping what happened that morning. Because some wounds are not visible. Some remain long after the blood has been cleaned, the rooms have been emptied, the police tape has been removed, and the photographs of the dead have become memorial pictures. And then there was Mark Chahal. After leaving the house, he did not disappear into the wilderness. He went to a nearby motel. There, investigators would later discover the weapons and a short apology. Then, around 11 o'clock in the morning, less than an hour after the massacre, by the time police reached him, he was dead. 10 people had died that morning if the gunman himself was included. 9 innocent people had been killed inside or around the Gacall family home. and a wedding that had been expected to bring hundreds of people together was suddenly replaced by grief. The groom was still traveling toward Vernon. He was supposed to be arriving for the happiest day of his life. Instead, he was traveling toward a house where his future bride and almost her entire immediate family had been murdered. Relatives were still making their way toward Vernon from other parts of Canada. Some were traveling from Toronto. Others had come from much farther away. Guests had been expected from England and India. They were coming to celebrate. Instead, they would arrive to find a community in shock. But the most disturbing part of the story was not simply what happened during those few minutes. It was what had happened before them. Because the massacre did not emerge from an empty space. There had been a marriage. There had been separation. There had been fear. There had been allegations of violence. There had been threats. There had been attempts to seek help. And there had been information in the hands of authorities before the morning of April 5th. In the months before the killings, Rajwar had repeatedly expressed concerns about her estranged husband. She had returned to Vernon and moved back in with her parents. Investigation. Chahal had threatened Rajwar and members of her family. Those warnings would become crucial after the massacre. Because once 9 people were dead, investigators were forced to look backward. They had to reconstruct a story that had not begun with gunfire. They had to ask what had happened inside the marriage. What had driven the relationship to collapse? What had Rajwar told police? What had Chahal said? What did the family know? What did the authorities know? And perhaps the most painful question of all, could the morning of April 5th have ended differently? At first, the town did not have answers. It only had the aftermath. A quiet neighborhood transformed into a crime scene. A family home surrounded by investigators. The bodies of people who had been preparing for a wedding. A little girl wounded. Children who had survived. A bride who would never walk down the aisle. A father who would never see his daughter married. A mother who would never watch her children grow older. Brothers and sisters who would never again sit together around the family table. And a husband who had turned his anger toward an entire family before ending his own life. The tragedy would soon become known as the Vernon Massacre, one of the worst mass killings in Canadian history at the time. But statistics can make human beings disappear. 9 victims. 10 dead. Gunmen. 3 minutes. Those numbers are easy to repeat. They are much harder to understand. Because 9 was not a number inside that house. 9 was Carnell. 9 was Darshan. 9 was Rajwar. 9 was Balinder. 9 was Kalinder. 9 was Halvinder. 9 was Jaspal. 9 was Jasbir. 9 was Roger. Each had a name. Each had a face. Each had a place in someone's life. And one of them, Balwinder, was supposed to be the bride. Her wedding was so close that relatives had gathered in the family home that morning. The groom was traveling toward her. People were preparing for photographs and celebrations. The future was supposed to begin that day. Instead, the future disappeared. And at the center of the tragedy was Rajwar. She was not simply one of the 9 people killed. She was the person at the center of the relationship that investigators believed had triggered Chahal's rage. She had separated from him. She had returned to her family. She had tried to move forward. And on the morning of April 5th, she was surrounded by the people who had given her a place to return to. Her parents. Her sisters. Her brother. Her extended family. The people who had stood beside her when her marriage collapsed. The family itself had become part of the grievance. He was not simply coming for an estranged wife. He was coming for the people around her. That is what makes the case so difficult to comprehend. The family had not been gathered for a confrontation. They had been gathered for a wedding. They were not expecting an argument. They were expecting guests. They were not preparing for death. They were preparing for a new beginning. And yet, somewhere before that morning, Chahal had apparently made a decision. He had acquired weapons. He had arranged transportation. He had traveled toward Vernon. Investigators would later conclude that he had planned the attack and may initially have intended to escape afterward. That detail changes the shape of the story, because it suggests that this was not simply a moment of uncontrollable rage. There was movement. There was preparation. There was a destination. There was a family chosen as the target. And then, after the shooting, there was another decision. Suicide. A final act that ended the life of the person responsible, but also eliminated the possibility of a courtroom, where the victims' families could look at him and ask why. There would be no cross-examination, no confession in court, no sentence, no prison cell, no opportunity for the families to hear him explain, in his own voice, have to be assembled from fragments. Police reports, witness accounts, statements made before the massacre, evidence from the house, weapons, the motel room, the short apology he left behind, and the memories of people who survived. But perhaps the most important evidence would come from a document that existed before the massacre. A statement made by Rajwar. A statement containing fears about what might happen to her and her family. A statement that, according to later testimony, contained serious allegations and threats. That document would become one of the most devastating pieces of the story because it forced investigators, officials, and the public to confront something far larger than one man's violence. It forced them to confront the space between a warning and a response, between fear and action, between a woman saying she was afraid and a system deciding how seriously that fear should be treated. On April 5, 1996, those questions were still hidden beneath the immediate horror. All the town knew was that something terrible had happened on Mission Hill. The details came slowly. First, reports of gunfire, then police vehicles, then ambulances, then the realization that there were multiple victims, then the names, and finally, the unbearable people who had been caught inside the violence. The story spread through Vernon with the speed that tragedy always seems to travel. Neighbors looked toward the house. People called relatives. The Sikh community began trying to understand what had happened to one of its families. And somewhere on the road toward Vernon, the groom was still traveling. He did not yet know that the wedding he was heading toward no longer existed. The house he was expecting to enter as a future husband was now a crime scene. The woman he expected to marry was dead. The family waiting to welcome him was almost entirely gone. The celebration had become a funeral before the guests had even arrived. And this is where the story truly begins. Not with the sound of gunfire, not with the moment Mark Chahal pulled the trigger, but with the realization that, behind the locked doors of an ordinary family home, something had been building for months. A marriage had failed. A woman had become afraid. A family had tried to protect her. Warnings had been made. And on one April morning, a man drove toward a house where people were preparing for a wedding. He arrived carrying 2 guns. He left behind 9 dead. Then he took his own life. For the people outside that house, the question was simple and horrifying. How could something like this happen in a quiet Canadian town? But for investigators, another question would become if. What had Rajwar tried to tell people? What did her family know? What did Mark Chahal believe he was entitled to do? And how many moments had existed when the path toward that house might still have been stopped? To answer those questions, we have to go backward. Before the blood. Before the sirens. Before the motel room. Before the wedding invitations and the arriving guests. Back to a young woman named Rajwar Gakal, a marriage that began with hope, and the series of warnings that would later cast a terrible shadow over the morning of April 5, 1996. Because the most frightening thing about this case is not simply that 9 people were killed in a matter of minutes. It is that, long before those minutes began, there were already signs that someone was afraid, and someone somewhere had been given a chance to listen. Before the police arrived, before the investigators began photographing rooms and marking evidence, before the names of the dead were released to a stunned community, the Gakal home was still a family home. That distinction matters, because crime scenes are often remembered by what happened inside them. The blood, the bodies, the broken glass, the weapons, the evidence markers. But a house does not begin as a crime scene. It begins as a place where people live, where someone leaves a cup, where a jacket is thrown over a chair, where family photographs hang on walls, where people argue, laugh, eat, pray, plan, worry, and dream. The Gakal home was all of those things. And on April 5, 1996, it was supposed to be filled with the restless energy that comes before a wedding. There is something particular about a house preparing for a wedding. People arrive earlier than expected. Doors open and close. Someone is always looking for something. A dress needs to be moved. Food needs to be prepared. A relative needs to be called. A child needs to be watched. Someone remembers something that has been forgotten. There is anticipation in every room. For the Gakal family, That anticipation was connected to 24-year-old Ballwinder Kaur Gakal. She was going to be married. The family had every reason to believe that the coming hours would become part of their happiest memories. Instead, those memories would be frozen forever in the hours before the shooting. That is one of the cruelest features of a tragedy like this. The ordinary details do not disappear. They remain. The wedding preparations remained. The expectation of arriving relatives remained. The plans remained. But the people who had made those plans were suddenly gone. The morning was already underway when Mark Chahal approached the property. There was no dramatic warning that would announce no battlefield, no extraordinary setting, just a residential neighborhood and a family preparing for a ceremony. Karnail Singh Gakal was outside. He was 50 years old. His daughter was about to be married. And then he saw the man who had once been part of his family, Mark Chahal. For Rajwar, Chahal was not simply an acquaintance. He was her husband. But they had separated. The marriage had broken down after a relatively short period, and Rajwar had returned to Vernon and to her parents. That decision would become central to everything that followed. Because leaving a marriage is one thing. Leaving a dangerous relationship can be something entirely different. There is the physical act of walking away. Then there is the question of whether the person you are leaving will accept that the relationship is over. According to the information later examined by investigators, Rajwar had reason to fear Chahal. There had been allegations of violence. There had been threats. There had been contact with police. There were concerns serious enough that, after the massacre, investigators would have to examine not only what Chahal had done on April 5th, but what had happened in the weeks and months leading up to it. The warning signs did not arrive all at once. They existed as separate pieces. A relationship in trouble. A woman returning to reports made to authorities. Threatening behavior. And a man who apparently did not accept the separation in the way Rajwar hoped he would. Then came the wedding. The timing could hardly have been more significant. Ballwinder was preparing to marry. Family members had traveled to Vernon. The house was crowded with people. For Chahal, the sight of that family together may have represented something very different from what it represented to them. To the family, it was a celebration. To him, investigators would later conclude, the family had become the focus of resentment and revenge. That distinction is important when trying to understand targeted family violence. The victims do not have to understand why they have become targets. They may be completely unaware of the story that the offender has created inside his own mind. A family can be eating breakfast while someone else is constructing a narrative of betrayal. A woman can be trying to rebuild her life while an estranged partner interprets that independence as humiliation. A wedding can symbolize love and renewal to one person and rejection to another. The violence begins long before the weapon is fired. It begins in the offender's perception. In the story he tells himself, in the belief that someone else is responsible for his pain. And when that belief becomes rigid enough, the people around the supposed source of the grievance happened in Vernon. Rajwar was the woman at the center of the failed marriage. But Rajwar was not alone. She had returned to a family. Her family had given her somewhere to go. Her parents had remained close to her. Her brothers and sisters were part of her life. They were not participants in the marriage. They had not chosen the separation. Yet on that morning, they would become victims. This is where the word family takes on a terrible double meaning. The family was the place Rajwar returned to for safety. It was also the place Chahal came looking for her. And that meant the place that was supposed to protect her became the place where the violence reached its largest scale. Outside, Karnail was killed first. Inside, the family had little time to comprehend what was happening. The attack was fast. That speed is difficult to imagine. People often picture violence as a prolonged event because the consequences are so enormous. 9 lives. 9 families of memories. 9 sets of relationships. 9 futures erased. But the event itself unfolded in minutes. That is part of what makes mass violence so psychologically difficult to process. The mind wants to slow it down. It wants to create enough time for people to react. Enough time for someone to recognize the danger. Enough time for someone to stop the attacker. Enough time for a warning to be heard. Entered the home armed with 2 handguns. A neighbor later recalled seeing him holding a weapon in each hand. He fired repeatedly. The sound of gunfire shattered what had been a normal morning. Inside the house, people became targets without warning. The wedding preparations stopped. The conversation stopped. The plans for later that day stopped. There was no later for the people Chahal killed. 6 victims would be found dead at the scene. 3 more would be transported to hospital, but would not survive their wounds. Among them was Ballwinder, the young woman whose wedding was supposed to define the day. Her wedding would become a funeral. Her family would become a list of names. And the house would become the physical symbol of what had happened. There was also a 6-year-old girl, Justine Saran. She survived being shot. That single fact creates another layer of horror in an already devastating story. A child was inside that home. She was old enough to understand fear, but far too young to understand why the adults around her were suddenly dying. She survived physically. But surviving a massacre does not mean returning to the life that existed before it. There is a before, and there is an after. For the survivors of the Gakal family, the word after would carry an entirely different meaning. After the police arrived. After the ambulances left. After the reporters came. After the questions. After people stopped calling every day. After the house was no longer surrounded by police. After the wedding date passed. After photographs that had once been taken for celebration became photographs used to remember the dead. The massacre would become part of their lives rather than an event that simply ended. And yet, in the immediate aftermath, there was another question. Where was Chahal? He had left the house. He had gone to a motel. For a brief period, investigators had reason to believe that he might have intended to escape. He had apparently rented a van in Kelowna before the attack. That detail suggested preparation. It suggested that he had thought about what would happen after the shooting. Perhaps he expected to leave the area. Perhaps he imagined another life waiting somewhere else. Perhaps the violence itself was supposed to be the final act of a plan that included escape. But whatever he intended, it did not happen. Around 11 o'clock that morning, Chahal was found dead in the motel after shooting himself. The man who had killed 9 people had eliminated the possibility of ever being questioned in a courtroom. There would be no trial, no jury, no prison sentence, no moment when the families could hear evidence presented and watch the accused answer questions. There would only be a particular kind of unfinished ending. The police can establish what happened. They can establish weapons. They can establish movements. They can establish timelines. They can speak to witnesses. They can examine documents. But there is a difference between discovering what someone did and understanding why he convinced himself he had the right to do it. Chahal left behind a short apology. But an apology cannot restore a life. It cannot return a daughter to her parents. It cannot return parents to their children. It cannot give a bride back her wedding day. It cannot remove a bullet from a 6-year-old child. It cannot erase the memory of a house becoming a killing ground. And it cannot answer the questions that had existed before the shooting. What happened inside the marriage? When did the relationship become dangerous? What did Rajwar tell people? What did her family fear? What did Chahal threaten? When did the possibility of violence become a real possibility? And when did the authorities have enough information to recognize the danger? These questions would eventually become as important as the mechanics of the massacre itself. Because after a homicide, investigators look backward. They reconstruct. They connect. They search for the first point at which the final outcome might have been visible. Sometimes that point is obvious. Sometimes it is hidden in paperwork that seemed insignificant when it was created. In this case, the warnings surrounding Rajwar would become impossible to ignore after 9 people were dead. Before the shooting, those warnings belonged to a private domestic conflict. After the shooting, they became evidence in the story of a mass killing. That transformation is one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. A woman says she is afraid. People around her hear it. Authorities record it. Life continues. Then something happens that makes everyone look backward and realize that the fear was not theoretical. The danger was real. The threat was real. The consequences were real. But hindsight has a cruel advantage. It already knows the ending. Those living through the earlier moments did not. On April 5th, the people inside the Gakal home were not living in hindsight. They were living in the morning. They were thinking about the wedding. They were thinking about family. They were thinking about the hours ahead. They could not know that those hours would never come. And that is why the beginning of this story should not be remembered only as the beginning of a massacre. It should be remembered as the final ordinary morning of 9 people. Karnail had a life before that morning. Darshan had a life before that morning. Rajwar had a life before that morning. Balwinder had plans for a future. Balwinder was 17. Jaspal was 14. Jasbir was 30. Roger was 33. Justine was 6. These were not characters waiting to enter a tragedy. They were people living lives that had nothing to do with the story history would later tell about them. That is something true crime often risks losing. When a case becomes famous, the victims can become secondary to the killer. His face becomes recognizable. His name becomes the title. His motives become the subject of documentaries. His behavior becomes analyzed. His final actions become dissected. Meanwhile, the people he killed can become numbers. But the Gakal massacre cannot be understood that way. The central fact is not that Mark Chahal killed 9 people. The central fact is that 9 people were living when that morning began. They had relationships. They had responsibilities. They had memories. They had unfinished conversations. They had plans for the future. And then a man entered their lives with guns. The tragedy is not only that they died. It is that they were denied every ordinary moment that would have come afterward. Balwinder would never have another birthday. Jaspal would never become an adult. Halvinder would never discover the person she might have become. Rajwar would never know what her life could have looked like after leaving the marriage. Jasbir and Roger would never continue building their life. The family would never gather again in the same way. The wedding would never take place. And Vernon would never look at the Gakal name in quite the same way again. By late morning, the physical violence was over. But the emotional violence had only begun. Police would begin documenting the house. Investigators would begin collecting evidence. Medical personnel would begin treating the survivors. Families would begin receiving impossible news. The community would begin asking questions. And somewhere beneath all of it was a question that would haunt the case for years. Was this tragedy inevitable? Or were there moments when someone could have recognized the danger before it became fatal? The answer would not be simple. There is rarely a single moment in a case of domestic violence where one person can point to a calendar and say, "This was the exact moment everything changed." Instead, there are small changes. A relationship becomes tense. A partner becomes controlling. A threat is made. Someone leaves. Someone follows. Someone calls police. Someone promises to stop. Someone says they are afraid. And life continues. Until one day, life does not continue. For the Gakal family, that day was April 5th, 1996. The tragedy began with grievance. It became a planned attack. And in a matter of minutes, it became a massacre. But the real story is larger than those minutes. It is the story of what happened before them. It is the story of a woman who tried to leave. It is the story of a family that stood around her. It is the story of a man who transformed separation into revenge. And it is the story of the warnings that would later force an entire community to ask whether the signs of danger had been visible all along. The answer to that question would emerge slowly, not from one piece of evidence, not from one dramatic confession, but from the fragments left behind after the gunfire stopped. And before those fragments could be examined, there was one final image that would define the beginning of the investigation. A wedding home. A family almost entirely gone. A little girl who survived. And a community standing outside, trying to understand how a place prepared for celebration had become the scene of 9 deaths. The morning had started with a family waiting for the future. By noon, there was almost no future left to wait for. And the deeper investigators looked into the lives behind those 9 names, the clearer one thing became. The massacre had not begun when Chahal arrived with guns. The final act had begun long before that. It had begun with a relationship that was supposed to be a marriage. With a family that took her back. With threats that would later appear terrifyingly prophetic. And with a man who, rather than accepting the end of the relationship, began moving toward revenge. To understand how an ordinary family mourning could end in one of Canada's most devastating acts of family violence, we have to leave the crime scene behind. We have to go back to the beginning. Back to the people before they became victims. Back to Rajwar before she became a name in an investigation. Back to the Gakal family before their home became known for death. Because before April 5th, 1996, they were not a crime story. They were simply a family. And that is where the next chapter begins. There is a moment in every investigation when the present begins to lose its grip on the story. The bodies have been found. The weapons have been recovered. The suspect is dead. The immediate danger is gone. And yet the questions have only multiplied. Investigators begin to move backward through time. They start with the final minutes and work toward the first warning. They ask who was there, who had a reason to be there, who had threatened whom, who had called police, who had been afraid, who had tried to leave, who had refused to accept that a relationship was over. And in the Gakal case, that backward journey would eventually lead to one woman. On April 5, 1996, she would become one of 9 victims. But if the story begins only with her death, then the most important part of her life has already been erased. Before she became a victim, Rajwar was a daughter. She was a sister. She was a young woman who had married, tried to build a life with her husband, and then found herself in a relationship she no longer felt safe inside. When the marriage began to collapse, she did something that can sound simple when described in one sentence. She left. She went back to Vernon. She returned to her parents. But leaving a relationship does not necessarily mean leaving the person behind. A separation can create distance without creating acceptance. One person can believe the relationship is finished. The other can believe that it is not. And when fear, anger, possessiveness, and humiliation become part of that equation, the distance between two people can become dangerous rather than protective. That was the environment surrounding Rajwar in the period before the massacre. The exact sequence of every interaction would later be examined by investigators and officials. But the broad picture was deeply troubling. There had been allegations of violence. There had been threats. Rajwar had expressed concerns about Chahal. Police had been contacted, and the family knew enough about the situation. She had returned to the home of the people who had known her long before Mark Chahal entered her life. Her parents' house was familiar territory. It was where she belonged. It was where her family could surround her. It was also where Chahal eventually came. That is one of the cruel ironies at the heart of the case. The home was not chosen because it was isolated. It was not chosen because no one would notice. It was chosen because Rajwar was there. And Rajwar was there because she had gone home. The family had become her refuge. On the morning of April 5th, that refuge became the target. The massacre would later be described through numbers and statistics. 9 people killed. 2 injured. 1 gunman dead. But those numbers conceal the fact that several separate lives converged inside that house that morning. There was the older generation, Karnail and Darshan. There were their children. Rajwar, Balinder, Kalwinder, Halvinder, Jaspal. There was their daughter Jasbir and her husband Roger Saran. There were children. There were relatives. There was a family preparing for one of the rituals that had always carried enormous significance, a marriage. Balwinder, 24 years old, was about to become a bride. That is important. The family was not gathering around Rajwar's failed marriage. They were gathering around Balwinder's future. 2 very different stories were occupying the same house. One was about an ending. The other was about a beginning. And somehow, in Chahal's mind, they became connected. That is where the psychology of the crime becomes difficult. It is tempting to search for a motive that makes the violence understandable. But explanation is not justification. Understanding how an offender constructs his reasoning does not mean accepting that reasoning. In cases of intimate partner violence, offenders may interpret separation as rejection, independence as betrayal, and the involvement of family members as interference. The person who leaves becomes the person who supposedly caused the offender's suffering. The relatives who support that person become obstacles. The entire family can be transformed in the offender's mind from human beings into symbols. And once people are reduced to symbols, the distance between resentment and violence can become terrifyingly small. The Gakal family did not need to agree with Chahal's perception. They did not even need to understand it. He only needed to believe it. That belief would be enough to turn a family gathering into a target. The preparations for Balwinder's wedding therefore carried a significance that went beyond celebration. They were a woman moving into a new chapter. They represented a family coming together. And Rajwar was also there, back with her parents, surrounded by relatives. If Chahal was still angry about the separation, the sight of that family together may have intensified whatever grievance he had built in his mind. But anger alone does not explain what happened next. The attack required preparation. The available evidence indicated that Chahal had obtained firearms. He had apparently made arrangements that suggested he was thinking about what would happen after the shooting. A van had been rented in Kelowna. That detail would later matter because it raised the possibility that he initially intended to survive the attack and leave the area. This was not simply a man who happened to encounter a gun and suddenly lose control. There were indications of planning. There was a destination. There were weapons. There was transportation. And there was a family he intended to confront. The distinction matters because the word rage can sometimes make an act of violence sound temporary, almost accidental. But a planned act has a different architecture. Someone has time to stop. Someone has time to reconsider. Someone has time to put the weapon down. Someone has time to turn the vehicle around. Someone has time to imagine the faces of the people who will be waiting inside. Yet Chahal continued toward Vernon, toward the wedding. And when he arrived, he did not stop at the door to negotiate. He carried 2 guns. Carnell was outside. The first shots were fired. Then Chahal entered the house. Everything that had been ordinary became urgent. The people inside had only moments. A person does not have to know the entire story to know that gunfire means danger. But knowing there is danger and being able to escape it are 2 different things. A house filled with people can become a trap when an armed attacker controls the movement through it. The attack was over within minutes. That sentence is easy to read. It is much harder to comprehend, because each second represented a decision. Each shot represented a choice. Each victim represented a life that would not continue. The first person killed was Carnell Singakal. Then the violence moved into the house. Darshan was killed. Rajwar was killed. Balwinder was killed. Kalwinder was killed. Halvinder was killed. Jaspal was killed. Jasbir was killed. Roger was killed. And somewhere in the middle of the violence, a 6-year-old girl was wounded. Justine Saran survived. Her survival would become one of the few points of light in an otherwise almost total destruction of the family. But there were other children inside the house as well. Some were not physically wounded bullets. But the absence of physical injury does not mean an absence of trauma. For a child, witnessing violence on that scale can divide life into 2 periods: before and after. For the adults who survived, the same division would exist. There would be the world before April 5th, and the world afterward. The world before contained a family. The world afterward contained photographs of that family. Before, Balwinder was a bride-to-be. After, she was remembered through the wedding that never happened. Before, Rajwar was a young woman trying to rebuild her life. After, her history became part of the investigation into why she was killed. Before, Carnell was a father. After, he became the first victim in a massacre. Before, the family home was simply where they lived. After, investigators would walk through it looking for evidence. That transformation happened in a matter of minutes. But the psychological transformation of the people left behind would continue for decades. Meanwhile, the man responsible was moving away from the house. Chahal went to a motel. For investigators, this created another layer of uncertainty. Was he planning to flee? Had the motel always been part of the plan? Was suicide intended from the beginning? Or did his decision change after he realized what he had done least been considered? The motel suggested a temporary destination. And then came the final act. Around 11 that morning, Chahal shot himself. The investigation had barely begun, and already the person at its center was dead. That meant there would be no traditional prosecution. The case would never proceed through the ordinary stages of criminal justice. There would be no accused sitting in a courtroom. No defense attorney arguing his case. No prosecutor presenting the victim's stories to a jury. No sentence. No prison. No possibility of parole. No opportunity for a judge to tell him, in a courtroom, exactly what the law thought of what he had done. The families would have to live with an answer that is common in murder-suicide cases, and deeply unsatisfying. The person responsible was gone. But the questions remained. One of those questions concerned the short apology Chahal left behind. What does an apology mean when the person receiving it is dead? What does regret mean when it arrives after the irreversible act? Can a few words carry the weight of 9 lives? For the families, they could not. There are moments in a tragedy when language becomes almost useless. Sorry. Regret. Anger. Revenge. Grief. None of those words none can describe what it means for a young woman to be preparing for a wedding while her sister is dying in another room. None can describe what it means for a child to survive a shooting that killed members of her family. And none can restore what was lost. The Gakal family had been building something across generations. Like many immigrant families, they had carried a cultural identity with them from Punjab and established roots in a new country. Their home was part of that journey. Their children represented another generation growing up in Canada. Their daughter's wedding was supposed to be a moment when family history and future came together. Instead, the family history was violently broken. That is why the massacre resonated beyond Vernon. It was not simply a crime committed against 9 individuals. It struck at the sense of safety surrounding a family home. It struck at a community preparing to celebrate. And it exposed the danger that can exist when domestic violence follows someone back to the place where they believe they are safe. The questions became larger. What should happen when someone reports threats from an estranged partner? How should authorities assess the risk? What signs indicate that an abusive relationship is moving toward lethal violence? What happens when the person making the threats also has access to firearms? And perhaps most importantly, what happens when the victim's fear is treated as a private future violence? These questions would become part of the official examination that followed. The tragedy would eventually be studied not only as a mass shooting, but as a case involving intimate partner violence, threats, firearms, and institutional response. That distinction is crucial. If we remember the event only as a mass shooting, we see the final explosion. If we examine the domestic violence that preceded it, we see the pressure building underneath. The gunfire was the final stage. The relationship was the beginning. And that means the story cannot be told responsibly by focusing exclusively on Mark Chahal. His name is part of the case. His actions are central to understanding it. But the story belongs first to the people who were killed. Karnail, Darshan, Rajwar, Balinder, Kalwinder, Halvinder, Jaspal, Jaspir, Roger. 9 names, 9 lives, 9 separate futures, 1 family, and a child who survived. When the news began spreading through Vernon, people would have struggled to comprehend the scale of what had happened. A family preparing for a wedding had been almost completely destroyed. The community that expected to gather for celebration would instead gather in grief. People changed direction. The purpose of their journey had vanished. The celebration had become mourning. And for those who had known the Gakals, the questions were not abstract. They were personal. Why them? Why that morning? Why the whole family? Why did Rajwar have to die? Why did a woman who had left a troubled marriage have to lose her entire family? Why did a young bride have to die on the morning she was supposed to begin a new life? Why were children caught in the violence? And could anything have been done before the guns appeared? The investigation would attempt to answer some of these questions. But there is a limit to what an investigation can reconstruct. It can establish that Chahal arrived. It can establish that he was armed. It can establish that he killed 9 people. It can establish that he later killed himself. It can examine the warnings that came before. But it cannot fully enter the mind of a dead man. It cannot know every thought he had during the drive toward Vernon. It cannot know what he felt as he approached the house. It cannot know whether he hesitated. It cannot know whether he understood, even for a moment, the scale of the destruction he was about to cause. And perhaps that uncertainty is part of what makes cases like this so disturbing. The dead cannot explain themselves. The victims cannot tell investigators what they were thinking during those final moments. Survivors carry memories that no report can completely reproduce. So the truth exists in fragments. A statement. A witness. A weapon. A rental record. A police report. A motel room. A letter. A family photograph. And the empty spaces left behind by the people who should have been there. The most important of those fragments may be the warnings that existed before the massacre. Because those warnings challenge the comforting idea that terrible violence always arrives without notice. Sometimes there are signs. Sometimes someone says, "I am afraid." Sometimes a relationship has already crossed boundaries that should never have been crossed. Sometimes threats are dismissed as anger that will pass. Sometimes family members recognize danger, but do not know what they can do. And sometimes the system receives information without fully understanding what that information will eventually mean. The Gakal case would force those questions into the open. Not because the tragedy could be undone. It could not. But because the people who died could not speak afterward. Others had to speak for them. And that process began as investigators started reconstructing the final morning. What time did Chahal arrive? Where was Karnail? Who was inside the house? How many shots were fired? How did Chahal leave? Where did he go? What did he leave behind? And before all of that, what happened between Chahal and Rajwar? The answers would gradually form a picture of a relationship that had deteriorated into fear and resentment. But the deeper investigators went, the more they encountered a problem that would define the case. The massacre was over. The gunman was dead. There would never be a trial. So the courtroom would not become the place where the story was fully reconstructed. Instead, the investigation itself would have to carry the burden. Every document would matter. Every witness would matter. Every previous complaint would matter. Every detail surrounding the separation would matter. Because there was no living offender left to tell the story from his side. And there was no future in which the victims could tell theirs. Only the evidence remained. And evidence does not grieve. It does not explain. It does not forgive. It simply waits to be examined. In the days after April 5th, that examination would begin. The family home would be treated as a crime scene. The survivors would begin the long process of recovery. The community would begin mourning. Investigators would begin interviewing witnesses. And officials would begin confronting a question that would become impossible to avoid. Rajwar authorities had received information. So how had the situation progressed from a troubled marriage to 9 deaths? The answer would require going back further than the morning of the massacre. Further than the guns. Further than the motel. Further than the wedding. It would require reconstructing the relationship between Rajwar and Mark Chahal from the point where it had first begun to fracture. Because if the final minutes tell us what happened, the months before them may tell us why the danger was not seen, or not stopped in time. And that is where the story moves next. Away from the crime scene. Away from the 9 bodies. Away from the motel where the gunman would die. Back into the life of the woman who had tried to leave. Back into the family that had opened its doors to her. Back into a marriage that had started as one story and ended as another. Before there was a massacre, there was a relationship. Before there were 9 victims, there was one woman who was afraid. And before the name Gakal became associated with one of Canada's darkest mornings, they were simply a family preparing for a wedding. That is the part of the story that must never be forgotten. The morning did not begin with death. It began with people. People who expected another day. People who expected another year. People who expected a wedding. People who expected their children to grow older. People who believed they had a future noon. The tragedy of April 5th, 1996, can be measured in minutes. Its consequences cannot. Because when the gunfire stopped, the lives of the survivors had only begun to change. The funerals had not yet happened. The questions had not yet been asked. The official reviews had not yet begun. The community had not yet fully understood what had happened. And the story of Rajwar and Mark Chahal had not yet been reconstructed. But the first chapter of the tragedy had already been written. A woman left a marriage. She went home. Her family gathered around her. A wedding approached. A man who believed he had been wronged prepared himself. And on a spring morning in Vernon, he drove toward the house. The family was waiting inside. They did not know what was coming. They had no reason to believe that the man approaching their home would become the final person many of them ever saw. They were simply living. And that is perhaps the most important image to carry forward. Not the guns. Not the bodies. Not the police tape. Not the headlines. But the family before all of it. A family still together. A bride still waiting for her wedding day. A father still standing outside his home. A mother still surrounded by her children. A young woman who had gone back to the people she trusted. And a future that, then the future was taken away. And when the investigation began, everyone would have to look backward to understand how. Vernon, British Columbia, is the kind of place that can make violence feel like something that happens somewhere else. In the spring of 1996, the city sat in the North Okanagan, surrounded by the landscape that had made this part of British Columbia famous. Mountains rose in the distance. The Okanagan Valley stretched through the interior of the province, with lakes, orchards, rolling hills, and neighborhoods climbing gradually away from the flatter parts of town. It was not a place most people associated with mass murder. Vernon was a community of roughly 25,000 people at the time, small enough that people could recognize familiar faces, and large enough to offer the ordinary conveniences of a growing Canadian city. It was a place where families settled, children went to school, people went to work, and neighbors could spend years living only a few houses apart without ever expecting to witness anything extraordinary. The city had a reputation for being peaceful. That reputation mattered, because when violence finally arrived on April 5, 1996, it did not come to a city that was accustomed to it. It came to a community that believed its greatest dangers were ordinary ones. A traffic accident, a house fire, a break-in, they discuss over dinner and then move on from. Murder itself was uncommon. A mass shooting was almost unimaginable. The mayor at the time would later describe the killings as something the Okanagan Valley had never experienced before. The community was used to thinking of Vernon as a place where people came because they wanted peace. And that perception of safety was not simply an abstract reputation. It was woven into the way people lived. Children could play outside. Neighbors knew the streets around them. Families built homes and expected to remain there. The Gakal family had done exactly that. Karnail Singh and Darshan Kaur Gakal had arrived in Canada in the early 1970s with their two eldest daughters. They came from Punjab, India, carrying with them the expectations, traditions, and ambitions of a family beginning another chapter in another country. They were part of a broader wave of South Asian immigration that had transformed Canadian communities during the second half of the 20th century. Canada in the 1960s and 1970s was changing. For decades, immigration policies had placed severe restrictions on people from Asia and other parts of the world. Those restrictions began to change significantly in the 1960s, culminating in a new immigration system that placed greater emphasis on skills, education, and other qualifications rather than race. The possibility of building a future in Canada became more realistic. Karnail and Darshan took that opportunity. They settled in Vernon. They worked. They raised children. They became part of the community. More than 20 years passed. A generation grew up. The family that had once arrived as immigrants became a Canadian family with deep roots in the Okanagan. Their children were growing up between two worlds in the most natural way possible. There was the culture their parents had brought from Punjab. There was the Canadian community surrounding them. There was the Sikh community in Vernon. There were schools, jobs, friendships, family celebrations, religious gatherings, and the ordinary routines that eventually make a new country feel like home. The Gakals were not outsiders passing through Vernon. They had built a life there. Karnail became known in the community. Darshan was known as well. The family participated in the local Sikh community, and the parents were associated with the Vernon Sikh Temple and Cultural Society. Their home was not simply a private residence. It was part of a social world, a place where relatives gathered, a place where cultural traditions were maintained, a place where children grew up, a place where weddings could bring together enormous numbers of people. And in the spring of 1996, the family was preparing for another one. It was expected to involve hundreds of guests and several days of celebrations. People were traveling. Relatives were arranging their schedules. The bride's family was preparing the events that would lead into the wedding. The groom and his family were preparing to travel from Toronto. People were coming from different parts of Canada. Some guests were expected from much farther away. India, England, other places connected to the family through years of migration and marriage. The distance between those places and Vernon could be measured in thousands of kilometers. But weddings have a way of collapsing distance. People board airplanes. They pack formal clothing. They make phone calls. They arrange rides from airports. They bring gifts. They arrive carrying stories from the places they have lived. For the Gakal family, the approaching wedding represented exactly that kind of gathering. It was a moment when the family would become larger, at least temporarily. A moment when relatives who had not seen one another for months or years could sit together again. A moment when parents could watch another child begin married life. A moment when photographs would be taken and preserved. A moment that would become part of family history. Nobody looking at the house from the outside would have been able to see the danger developing inside the wider story. The family was preparing for a wedding. And the man who would eventually attack them was not an unknown criminal wandering through Vernon. He was connected to them. That is what makes the setting so important. This was not a random attack on strangers. The location had meaning. The house had meaning. The people inside had meaning. Chahal knew who lived there. He knew Rajwar was there. He knew the family. And he knew that the family was gathering. The closer the wedding came, the more concentrated the circumstances became. A celebration was approaching. Rajwar was back in her parents' home. Her marriage to Chahal had broken down. The family was together. The community was preparing to celebrate. And Chahal was preparing for something entirely different. But before we reach him, it is important to understand what the Gakal family had built in Vernon. Because the tragedy becomes easier to comprehend when we understand what was destroyed. Karnail and Darshan had spent more than 20 years creating stability. They had raised 6 children. The family was close. Their daughters had grown into young women. Their son was still a teenager. Their older children were beginning families of their own. This was not a household standing still. It was a household moving through generations. One daughter was already married. Another was married. Another was about to. The pattern was familiar to families everywhere. Children grow. Children leave. Children marry. Parents become grandparents. The family expands. Life moves forward. For Karnail and Darshan, the approaching wedding was another step in that process. Their daughter Balwinder was 24. She was preparing to marry a young man from Toronto. The groom was expected to arrive shortly before the wedding. His family would arrive as well. The celebrations were expected to involve a large gathering, and the house would become the center of that activity. There is something important about a wedding being held in a family home. The home becomes more than a building. It becomes a stage for transition. The bride is surrounded by relatives. Older women help with preparations. Younger people move between rooms. Food is prepared. Clothes are arranged. Guests arrivent. Stories are repeated. Photographs are taken. The bride's parents watch their daughter move toward a life they have been imagining for years. For immigrant parents, there can be an additional layer to that moment. They have crossed countries. They have built a new life. They have raised children in a different society. And then they watch those children form families of their own. The wedding becomes proof that the journey has continued. The survived. The children have grown. The future is still unfolding. That is what was supposed to happen in Vernon. Instead, the family gathering became a target. The geography of Vernon also mattered. The city was in the Okanagan, far from the urban centers that dominated much of British Columbia. Vancouver was several hours away. Kelowna was closer, but Vernon still had the feel of a smaller community. For someone unfamiliar with the area, it would not necessarily be a place where a mass killing would seem likely. For someone who lived there, the idea would have seemed almost absurd. People did not walk through the streets expecting a gunman. Parents did not send children to school believing they were entering a battlefield. Families did not gather for weddings thinking about escape routes. The very normality of the place was part of the horror. The Gakal home was situated in the Mission Hill area, a residential part of Vernon. The neighborhood was not some isolated industrial district. It was a place where houses stood among other houses, where people could see neighbors, where children could be outside, where ordinary domestic life unfolded behind windows. On the morning of April 5th, one of those ordinary lives belonged to neighbor Rick Young. He was outside with his children. Then he saw Chahal. Young would later describe the sight in terms that captured how surreal the attack was, and he was only a few yards away. And for a moment, Chahal looked directly at him. That eye contact is one of the most disturbing fragments from the morning, because it reminds us that the killer was moving through an inhabited neighborhood. He was not operating in some isolated space where no one could see him. There were children nearby. There were neighbors. There was a normal street. And yet he continued. Young believed he might be killed. Chahal had the opportunity. He could have turned the weapons toward the neighbor. But he did not. He turned back toward the Gakal home. That decision is revealing. The attack was targeted. The people inside were the focus. The violence was not random. Chahal had come for someone. Then, according to investigators, for more than one someone. The house was the destination. Rajwar was the connection. The family was the target. The wedding was the context. And the neighborhood was simply the quiet setting in which the violence unfolded. The attack itself lasted only a few minutes. But before it began, there had been another important location in the story. A motel. The Globe Motel. It was only a short distance from the Gakal home. Chahal had apparently checked in before the attack, using a name that was not his own and paying cash for 2 nights. The motel was not simply a place to sleep. He had traveled to the area. He had changed vehicles. He had brought firearms. He had arranged a room. He was close enough to the family home to make the final journey quickly. The night before the massacre, while the Gakal family was preparing for a wedding, Chahal was nearby. That contrast is difficult to ignore. Inside the family home, people were thinking about celebration. At the motel, the man who intended to destroy that celebration was waiting. The two worlds existed only a few kilometers apart. One was filled with plans for a future. The other was filled with a plan for violence. On April 4th, the day before the shooting, Chahal had driven toward Vernon. He had not simply arrived unexpectedly on Friday morning. He had apparently begun putting his plan into motion the day before. He packed. He took his firearms. He drove to Kelowna Airport. But he was not going to board a plane. Instead, he left his own vehicle and rented a dark-colored minivan. That detail later attracted investigators' attention. Why exchange vehicles? Why rent a van? Why leave his own car at an airport? One possible explanation was escape. If he intended to flee after the shooting, a rental vehicle would make it harder to trace him to his original car. Police later believed that the arrangement suggested he had considered leaving the area after the killing. It challenges another common assumption about murder-suicide. It is easy to imagine the offender as someone who has decided from the beginning that he will die alongside his victims. But the evidence in this case suggested something more complicated. Chahal may have intended to survive the attack. He may have intended to escape. The suicide came later. The exact moment when his plan changed is impossible to know with certainty. But the sequence itself is revealing. On Thursday, he prepared. He traveled. He changed vehicles. He checked into a motel. He remained near the family home. On Friday morning, he went to the house. He killed 9 people. He returned to the motel. And then he killed himself. The entire sequence unfolded within roughly a day. The Gakal family, meanwhile, was living inside a completely different timeline. Their timeline was measured in wedding preparations. The coming days were supposed to be full. The family expected visitors. They expected ceremonies. They expected food, photographs, greetings, and celebration. The bride was preparing. The groom was traveling. Relatives were arriving. The family had no reason to believe that the man who had separated from Rajwar was waiting only a few kilometers away. This is one of the defining characteristics of domestic violence that escalates present while the offender is living inside a grievance that has become detached from ordinary reality. The family may think the crisis has passed because the couple has separated. The offender may think the separation is the beginning of a new grievance. The woman may believe she has returned home. The offender may view that home as the place where she is hiding from him. The family may see a wedding as a celebration. The offender may see it as proof that life is continuing without him. None of those perceptions are equal. Only one belongs to the offender. But his perception can determine what he does. That is why the setting of the Gakal massacre cannot be reduced to an address. The location was part of a much larger emotional landscape. Vernon represented the life the Gakals had built. The family home represented safety. The wedding represented the future. The Sikh community represented belonging. The motel represented the attacker's temporary position outside that family world. And the road between the motel and the house became the final path between preparation and violence. There was another element that would later become impossible to ignore. The weapons. Chahal had obtained his firearms legally. At the time, his record did not contain criminal convictions that would automatically prevent him from acquiring them. This fact would become a major issue after the killings. Because a clean record does not necessarily mean a clean history, and domestic violence often occurs in private, outside the traditional criminal records that systems use to identify risk. In Chahal's case, police had previously received information concerning his relationship with Rajwar. That information existed, but it did not prevent him from possessing firearms. After the massacre, that fact would become one of the central questions of the official inquiry. Could the warning signs have been connected? Should they have been? What should happen when a person accused of domestic violence seeks access to guns? How should police determine whether threats made within a relationship represent an immediate danger? Those questions did not belong only to Vernon. They belonged to British Columbia. They belonged to Canada. And eventually, they would become part of a broader conversation about how institutions respond to violence against women. But on April 4th, none of that was visible from the outside. The Gacall family was simply preparing for a wedding. Their community was preparing to celebrate with them. The groom was traveling from Toronto. The family had plans for the next day, and Chahal was in a motel nearby. That night, the family could still imagine the future. The following morning, there would be no future for 9 of them. The contrast becomes even more painful when Winder was 17. Jaspal was 14. They were still students. They belonged to a younger generation than their parents and older sisters. They should have had years ahead of them. School. Friendships. Work. Relationships. Possibly marriage. Possibly children. Ordinary adulthood. None of those things would happen. Ballwinder, 24, was even closer to a major transition. Her wedding was not something she had already experienced and left behind. It was something waiting for her. She was on the threshold. She had a future that could be imagined, but had not yet begun. And Rajwar, 26, had also been standing at a threshold of a different kind. Her marriage had failed. She had returned to her family. She was attempting to rebuild her life. In another world, the family gathering might have represented the beginning of a new chapter for both sisters. One was preparing to marry. The other was trying to move beyond a marriage that had become dangerous. Instead, the same gathering became the place where both stories ended. The parents were killed. Their children were killed. A son-in-law was killed. And the family structure that had taken decades to build was almost completely destroyed in minutes. The wider community felt the impact immediately. The Gacalls were known. They had been part of Vernon for more than 20 years. Their loss was not the loss of strangers. It was the loss of people who had attended community events, worked in the area, raised children, and participated in religious and cultural life. The killings therefore created a sense of collective mourning. People were not simply asking how such a crime could happen. They were asking how it could happen here, in this city, in this neighborhood, to this family, at a wedding. The answer would not come easily. And in the first hours, there was no answer at all. There were only police cars, ambulances, witnesses, survivors, a house that had been filled with family, and the awful realization that the celebration had become a massacre. Later, thousands would attend the funeral service. The scale of the response would reveal how deeply the tragedy had affected the community. But on April 5th itself, the city was still trying to understand what had happened. People heard fragments. A shooting. Multiple victims. A family. A wedding. A husband. Then the numbers began to emerge. 9 killed. 2 injured. The gunman dead. The news traveled far beyond Vernon, across British Columbia, beyond the country. At the time, the Vernon killings were the second deadliest mass killing in Canadian history, behind the 1989 École Polytechnique massacre in Montreal. That comparison placed the Gacall tragedy into a grim national context. But for Vernon, national statistics meant little. The tragedy had a street. It had a house. It had a family. It had faces. The city was not looking at an abstract number. It was looking at an empty home, a wedding that would never happen, and families waiting for relatives who would never arrive. That is where the setting of this story ends. Not with the gunfire. Not yet, but with the quiet geography that made the gunfire so shocking. A small Canadian city, a residential neighborhood, a family home, a motel only a short distance away, a wedding approaching, a woman who had returned to her parents, a man who had come after her, and a community that believed it was safe. The distance between those two realities was only a few kilometers, but emotionally it was enormous. Inside the Gacall home, the future was being prepared. Outside it, a man was preparing to destroy that future. The family did not know what was waiting beyond their front door. They did not know that their ordinary neighborhood would soon become a national crime in Parliament. They did not know that an official inquest would later examine how the system had responded to warnings about Raj War. They did not know that generations of people would remember April 5, 1996, as the day Vernon changed. They only knew that a wedding was coming, and that, for a few more hours, was enough. The next morning would begin like any other morning, until a man arrived carrying 2 guns. And once he stepped toward the Gakal home, the quiet setting of Vernon would become the stage for a tragedy that would change the family, the community, and the conversation around domestic violence in British Columbia forever. To understand what was lost inside the Gakal home, it is necessary to understand what the family had spent years creating. The story of the Gakals did not begin in Vernon. It began much farther away, in Punjab, India, in a culture where family was not simply a word describing people related by blood. Family was structure. Family was identity. Family was responsibility. Family was memory carried from one generation to another. When Karnail Singh Gakal and Darshan Kaur Gakal came to Canada, they were not leaving everything behind. They were carrying much of it with them. They carried language. They carried religion. They carried traditions. They carried expectations for their children. And they carried the difficult hope to become more secure than the life they had left behind. For immigrant families, that transition can be complicated. The first generation remembers the old country in a way the next generation cannot. The children grow up surrounded by a new culture. They speak differently. They attend Canadian schools. They form friendships outside the community. They encounter ideas about independence, marriage, gender, and family that may not always fit neatly with the traditions their parents brought with them. And yet the family remains the bridge between those worlds. The Gakals were building that bridge in Vernon. They had arrived in Canada in the early 1970s with their 2 eldest daughters. More than 20 years later, those daughters were no longer little girls arriving in a new country with their parents. They were adults. The family had expanded. There were younger children. There were marriages. There were grandchildren and in-laws. There were relatives connected through generations. The Gakal household had become a place where several stages of life existed at once. The older generation carried memories of Punjab. The younger generation belonged to Canada in a different way. And between them was the family itself. That family was one reason the approaching wedding mattered so much. A wedding does more than unite 2 people. It brings families into contact. It creates new relationships or step into adulthood. For a family that had spent decades building a life in Canada, Balwinder's wedding could be understood as another sign that the family had put down roots. The journey that began in Punjab had produced children who were now creating families of their own. There was continuity. There was hope. There was a future. And that future was gathering momentum as April 1996 approached. The family expected visitors. Some would travel long distances. Some would arrive from other Canadian cities. Others would come from overseas. The preparations were not simply logistical. They were emotional. People were making plans because they expected the family to be together. They expected laughter. They expected conversations that might continue late into the night. They expected the bride to become the center of attention. They expected the parents to be proud. They expected photographs that would later be brought out on anniversaries and birthdays. That is what makes the tragedy so difficult to separate from the wedding itself. The wedding was not a minor detail. It was the reason the family was gathered in such numbers. It was the reason the house was unusually full. It was the reason relatives were in Vernon. It was the reason people were thinking about the future. And it was the backdrop against which an old conflict suddenly became lethal. Belonged to a Sikh community. For many Sikh families living far from Punjab, community institutions have historically played an important role in maintaining cultural and religious identity. The Gurdwara is not simply a place of worship. It can also be a gathering place. A place where people meet, where news travels, where weddings and funerals connect families, where newcomers can find people who understand their language and traditions. For the Gakals, the Sikh community in Vernon was part of the social world they had built. That meant their lives were connected to people beyond the walls of their own home. When tragedy struck, those connections would become painfully important. Neighbors would remember them. Friends would mourn them. Community members would attend funerals. People who had known the family for years would suddenly find themselves talking about them in the past tense. The effect of mass violence in a small community is different from the effect of violence in a huge city. In a large metropolitan area, terrible events can disappear into the volume of daily life. In a smaller community, they spread through personal connections. Someone knew the father. Someone had seen the mother. Someone's child had gone to school with one of the younger family members. Someone had attended the same religious gathering. Someone had spoken to Balwinder. Someone knew Rajwar, the social fabric of the town. That is why the massacre was experienced as a collective wound. The violence had taken place inside one home, but its psychological boundaries extended far beyond that property. The city itself had to process what had happened, and the Sikh community had to confront an even more painful reality. The family had not been attacked in some distant place. They had been attacked at home, the place where they were supposed to be safest. For Rajwar, that fact was particularly tragic. She had returned to her parents after her marriage to Mark Chahal broke down. Home was where she went. Home was where her parents could protect her. Home was where she could be surrounded by brothers, sisters, and relatives. The decision to return was a declaration of trust. She trusted her family enough to come back. Her family trusted that they could give her shelter. But the separation had not removed Chahal from the story. He remained connected to Rajwar through the failed marriage. And according to the information later examined by authorities, the relationship had already involved disturbing behavior. There had been allegations of violence. There had been threats. There had been concerns communicated to police. The family was therefore not completely unaware that the marriage had become dangerous. But knowing that a relationship is troubled is not the same as knowing that a person is planning a mass. People living through domestic conflict often have incomplete information. They see individual incidents. They hear individual threats. They may believe the person will calm down. They may believe separation will create distance. They may believe returning home will provide safety. They may not imagine that an estranged husband will decide to attack an entire household. Even when someone says, "I'm afraid," the people around them have to interpret what that fear means. Is it fear of another argument? Fear of harassment? Fear of being followed? Fear of physical assault? Or fear of death? The answer can be difficult to determine before the worst happens. Afterward, every warning seems clearer. Every threat seems more serious. Every unexplained behavior looks like part of a pattern. But before the violence, the future is not visible. That is one of the central tragedies of the Gakal case. The people involved were living without knowledge of the ending. Investigators would eventually have the advantage of hindsight. They would know that Chahal had been preparing. They would know he had weapons. They would know he had traveled to Vernon. They would know he had rented a vehicle. They would know he had checked into a motel. They would know that he would kill 9 people. But the Gakals did not have that information. On the morning of April 5th, they were not looking at a killer. They were looking at the possibility of the story becomes especially important. Imagine a family preparing for an event that has taken months to organize. There are clothes to prepare, people to accommodate, meals to arrange, visitors to welcome, a bride to help, phone calls to make, plans to confirm. There is probably little room in such a morning for thoughts about an estranged husband. The family had something else occupying their attention, Balwinder's future. And that future was becoming immediate. The wedding was close enough that people had begun arriving. The house would have been busier than normal. There were more people, more movement, more conversation, more reasons for someone to be outside. That was the setting when Chahal arrived. Not an empty house, not an isolated victim, a full family home. That may have increased the number of people exposed to the attack, but it also tells us something about the nature of the violence. Chahal was not simply seeking a private confrontation with Rajwar. If that had been the only objective, the presence of other people could have been an obstacle. Instead, he entered a situation where numerous family members were present, and they became victims. That is why the term family massacre is more revealing than simply calling it a domestic homicide. The violence expanded beyond the couple. Killed included Rajwar's parents, her siblings, her sister's husband, a young girl preparing for marriage, teenagers. The youngest victims were not participants in the marriage at all. They were simply family members. That fact makes the geography of the house almost unbearable to contemplate. Every room represented someone's ordinary life. A bedroom belonged to someone. A table had been used for meals. Clothing had been placed somewhere. Wedding preparations occupied space. People moved through the house because they knew where everything was. And then, suddenly, the familiarity of the home became part of the danger. The people inside did not have the luxury of treating the building as a crime scene. They were living there, until the first shots transformed it. Outside, the neighborhood continued to exist. Other homes remained standing. People continued their morning routines. Cars moved through the streets. Children were nearby. The contrast between ordinary life and the violence unfolding inside the Gakal home could not have been greater. One neighbor, Rick Young, was outside with his children when he saw Chahal. The image would remain with him. A man with a gun in each hand. A residential neighborhood. Children nearby. And a direction of travel that led toward the Gakal house. For the neighbor, the sight was frightening. What was happening was impossible to know. He could not know that 9 people were about to die. He could not know that the man he was seeing had already prepared for the attack. He could not know that the violence would soon become one of the most significant mass killings in Canadian history. That is another feature of moments before disaster. People rarely recognize them as historic. History does not announce itself. There is no voice saying, "Remember this moment." Everything is about to change. A man walks down a street. A family prepares breakfast. A bride adjusts her clothing. A father washes a car. A child moves through a room. A vehicle stops. Then the ordinary world breaks. And after it breaks, people reconstruct the final moments over and over. What did they see? What did they hear? What did they think? Could they have known? Could someone have intervened? Those questions can become part of a survivor's life. For the Gakal family, there would be very few people left to answer them. The loss was so extensive that the family's own internal memory was almost destroyed along with its members. The people who knew the victims best were among the dead. That creates a different kind of silence. A family photograph can show faces. A police report can provide names and ages. A newspaper can describe a wedding. But only the person was. When so many members of one family die together, much of that knowledge disappears at the same time. The surviving relatives inherit fragments. Someone remembers a story. Someone remembers a habit. Someone remembers a favorite food. Someone remembers a joke. Someone remembers how a person looked when they laughed. Those details may never appear in an official report, but they are the real substance of a human life. That is why the setting matters. The Gakal home was not merely the location where 9 people happened to be killed. It was the physical center of their relationships. Their family history had accumulated there. Their celebrations had taken place there. Their arguments had taken place there. Their children had grown up there. Their visitors had been welcomed there. And on April 5th, the home was preparing to host a wedding. The massacre therefore destroyed more than human lives. It destroyed the meaning of a place. For the people who survived, returning to that house would never be the same. A doorway could become a memory. A room could become a trigger. An ordinary street could become the place where a family member died. The home could no longer simply be home. It had become the location of the worst morning of their lives. That transformation is common after violent crime. Places retain memories. A street corner can become the place where someone was lost, bad news was delivered. A bedroom can become the place where someone took their final breath. And a family home can become a crime scene. The psychological boundaries of the tragedy therefore extended long after the police left. The house could be cleaned. The evidence could be removed. The police tape could disappear. But memory would remain. The wider community would also have to confront the fact that the violence had been connected to domestic abuse. That was important because domestic violence is often hidden behind the walls of private homes. From outside, a marriage may appear normal. Neighbors may see a couple arriving and leaving together. Relatives may know there are problems, but not know their full extent. Friends may hear only pieces. Authorities may receive isolated reports. And the person being threatened may continue trying to live a normal life. That is what makes domestic violence so difficult to detect. It can coexist with ordinary appearances. The Gakal family could be preparing a wedding while one member was dealing with the collapse of her own marriage. The two realities could exist in the same house. One sister was preparing to begin married life. Another was trying to escape one. The family was celebrating one woman's future while protecting another woman's present. That contrast was invisible to people outside the family. And perhaps even within the family, there is a temptation after a tragedy to believe that everyone should have known, that the warning signs were obvious. that the danger must have been unmistakable. But real life is not a police report. People do not receive events in chronological order with labels explaining their significance. They receive fragments. A conversation. A threat. An argument. A phone call. A report. A strange behavior. A promise. A period of calm. Then another problem. The meaning becomes clear only after the ending. By then it is too late. The Gakal case would become an important example of that problem. The later review of the events would examine how authorities had responded to information about Rajwar's situation and what could have been done differently. The purpose of such a review was not simply to assign blame. It was to understand the chain of decisions. What did people know? When did they know it? What did they do with that information? What information was missing? What systems were available? And what systems failed to connect? Those questions would eventually matter to other women facing violence. Because the tragedy in Vernon could not be undone. But lessons could potentially be drawn from it. The family could not be brought back. The wedding could not be... But perhaps another woman, somewhere else, could be taken more seriously when she said she was afraid. Perhaps another warning could lead to intervention. Perhaps another family could understand that threats following separation should not be dismissed. Perhaps another community could recognize that a quiet home does not necessarily mean a safe home. That possibility would become part of the legacy of the case. But on April 4th and the early hours of April 5th, no one was thinking about legacy. The Gakal family was thinking about the wedding. Chahal was thinking about something else. The two timelines were about to collide. By then, the geography of the tragedy was already fixed. Vernon. Mission Hill. The Gakal residence. The nearby motel. The road connecting the two. The rental vehicle. The weapons. The family gathering. The wedding preparations. Everything was in place. All that remained was for morning to arrive. And when it did, the city would wake up believing it was another spring day in the Okanagan. The mountains would still be there. The streets would still be there. The homes would still be there. People would still go to work. Cars would still travel through Vernon. The Sikh community would still be preparing for a wedding. But inside one house, the meaning of the day would change forever. They would fracture a family history that had taken decades to build. They would transform a wedding into a funeral. They would turn a private domestic conflict into a national conversation. And they would force a quiet Canadian community to confront a reality it had never expected to face. The danger was not coming from somewhere far away. It was already nearby. It had already entered the story. It had already been connected to the family. And now it was moving toward their front door. The Gakals had built their life in Vernon because they believed it could be home. On the morning of April 5th, that home would become the setting for one of the darkest crimes in the city's history. And before the first shot was fired, there was still one thing the world had not yet fully understood. The people inside that house were not simply a family gathered for a wedding. They were the people standing between Mark Chahal and the life he believed had been taken from him. To him, they may have represented the family that had welcomed Rajwar back. To the investigators who later reconstructed the case, they represented the widening circle of his grievance. But to one another, they were simply family. That distinction would soon cost them everything. And the next part of the story would move even closer to the people at the center of it, away from Vernon as a city and into the lives of the men, women, and children whose names would become permanently connected to that morning. Before the house became a crime scene, it was their home. And before the wedding became a symbol of what was lost, it was simply a wedding. The morning had not happened yet, but the pieces were already in place. All that remained was the arrival of April 5th. On the evening before the massacre, Vernon was still a city preparing for tomorrow. There was no visible sign that the morning would end in bloodshed. The Okanagan landscape was settling into another spring night. The streets were quieting. Houses were beginning to close their doors for the evening. Families were making plans for the next day. And inside the Gakal home, tomorrow had a name. Wedding. The word carried an entire future with it. For Balwinder Kaur Gakal, 24 years old, the approaching ceremony represented the beginning of married life. For her parents, Karnail Singh and Darshan Kaur, it was the moment when they would watch another one of their children step into adulthood. For brothers and sisters, relatives, and friends, it was a reason to gather. People had traveled considerable distances to be there. The family had spent years building relationships across Canada and beyond, and weddings were the moments when those scattered connections could briefly become one physical gathering. Someone who normally lived hundreds or thousands of kilometers away could suddenly be sitting in the same room. A relative who had not been seen. Stories could be repeated. New stories could begin. That was what April 5th was supposed to bring. The Gakal home was therefore carrying an unusual amount of anticipation that night. It was not simply another evening. It was the night before a family celebration. But only a short distance away, another kind of preparation was taking place. Mark Chahal was in Vernon. He had already traveled toward the city. He had obtained a rental vehicle. He had firearms. And he had taken a room at the Globe Motel. The motel would become one of the final locations in the story of the massacre. At the time, however, it was simply another motel room. A temporary space. A room occupied by a man who had traveled to Vernon under circumstances that would only become fully understood after his death. The contrast between that room and the Gakal home is almost impossible to ignore. In one place, a family was preparing for a wedding. In the other, the man investigators would identify as the killer was preparing for violence. The two worlds were close enough to be connected by a short drive. Yet the people inside the Gakal home did not know what was waiting nearby. They did not know that Chahal had rented a room. They did not know that he had changed vehicles. They did not know that he had brought firearms. They did not know that he might already have been considering what would happen after the killings. Next morning, that difference would become devastating. Chahal's relationship with Rajwar had already ended in all practical terms. The couple had separated. Rajwar had returned to her parents. But separation had not brought the clean ending that people often imagine. There had been allegations of violence and threats. Rajwar had contacted police. Her family knew there were problems. The marriage had become a source of fear rather than security. Yet life had continued. That is another uncomfortable truth about domestic violence. Even when something is seriously wrong, people still have to live. They go to work. They buy groceries. They take children to school. They answer the telephone. They attend religious services. They plan weddings. They make dinner. They sleep. A family can be dealing with fear while the rest of life continues around it. And that was the situation inside the Gakal household. There was a troubled marriage in the background. But there was also a wedding in the foreground. Balwinder's wedding was not going to wait for every family problem to be resolved. Life does not organize itself according to the logic of tragedy. People do not stop celebrating because danger may exist somewhere nearby. They continue. And sometimes that continuation is exactly what an abusive person building. The family begins moving forward. The offender sees that movement and interprets it through his own grievance. What looks like healing to everyone else can look like rejection to him. What looks like independence can look like betrayal. What looks like a new beginning can be interpreted as humiliation. The offender's perception becomes the lens through which everything is viewed. In Chahal's case, investigators would later conclude that revenge against Rajwar and her family was central to the attack. But there was no way for the Gakals to see the full picture that night. They could see only the man they knew, the estranged husband, the source of an increasingly troubled relationship. Perhaps they expected further arguments. Perhaps they feared harassment. Perhaps they worried that Chahal might continue to pursue Rajwar. But expecting trouble is not the same as expecting a massacre. That distinction is enormous. A person can be afraid of someone without imagining that the person will kill everyone in the house. A family can know that a marriage is dangerous without anticipating that an entire household will be targeted. And a police officer can receive a complaint about threats without knowing that the person making those threats will soon become responsible for 9 deaths. That is how warning signs can exist without immediately producing the outcome that hindsight later makes seem obvious. On the night of April 4th, the future was still unwritten. The family could still imagine the morning. They could still imagine Balwinder waking up as a bride. They could still imagine the groom arriving. They could still imagine the ceremonies. They could still imagine photographs. They could still imagine relatives laughing together. There is something almost unbearable about that kind of anticipation when viewed from the future. We know what the people inside the house did not. We know that the wedding would never take place. We know that the bride would never marry. We know that the parents would never watch her walk into a new life. We know that several of the children would never leave that home alive. But they did not know. For them, The future was still open. And perhaps that is how every tragedy feels to the people inside it. The last ordinary night does not feel like a last ordinary night. There is no announcement. No warning written across the sky. No indication that an ordinary conversation will become someone's final conversation. The final meal does not taste different. The final photograph does not look different. The final good night does not sound different. Only afterward do those moments become final. That is what April 4th was for the Gakal family. The last night before everything changed. While the family prepared, Chahal's movements were taking shape. Investigators would later learn that he had made a range area. He had obtained a vehicle. He had taken a motel room. He had brought weapons. The presence of the rental van would later become particularly significant. If the purpose had simply been to confront Rajwar and return home, why arrange transportation that could help him leave the area? The answer was never fully available because Chahal was dead before investigators could question him. But the evidence suggested that escape may have been part of his thinking. Perhaps he intended to drive away after the shooting. Perhaps he imagined himself crossing the border. Perhaps he had another destination. Perhaps the rental van was simply one element of a plan that never reached its final stage. We cannot know with certainty. What we do know is that he had created distance between his own vehicle and the place where he intended to carry out the attack. That is not the behavior of someone who simply wandered into an argument. It suggests forethought. And forethought is important because it means the violence existed in his mind before it existed in the world. The guns were not the beginning. The decision to use them was. The decision to travel was. The decision to approach the family was. The decision to bring weapons was. The decision to continue despite the consequences was. By the time Chahal arrived in Vernon, the most important choices had already been made. The Gakals had made very different choices. They had chosen to welcome relatives. They had chosen to build a future. Their decisions were about connection. His were about destruction. That contrast would become visible only afterward. On the night before the massacre, however, the city itself remained unaware. There was no lockdown. No warning broadcast. No emergency response. No reason for people to avoid the streets. Vernon continued as it always had. Perhaps people stopped for groceries. Perhaps families watched television. Perhaps some guests at the Gakal home talked late into the evening. Perhaps someone was still working on wedding preparations. Those details are not recorded in every surviving account, and it is important not to invent what cannot be known. But the larger reality is clear. The family was preparing for a wedding. Chahal was nearby. The danger was already present. And no one outside the unfolding plan could see its full shape. The Sikh community, meanwhile, had every reason to look forward to the gathering. A wedding was a community event as much as a family event. There were social expectations surrounding it. There was food. There were ceremonies. There were guests. There were people who had helped prepare. The family had reason to feel that Vernon would soon be filled with celebration. Instead, the following day would bring police officer Reef. That transition would be so abrupt that it would seem almost unreal. One moment, a wedding. The next, a massacre. One moment, a family. The next, a crime scene. One moment, a young woman was preparing to marry. The next, she was dead. One moment, a father was thinking about his daughter's wedding. The next, he was the first victim. This is why the setting cannot be treated merely as background. The city, the neighborhood, the family home, and the approaching wedding all contributed to the emotional force of what happened. Vernon represented normal life. The Gakal home represented family. The wedding represented hope. And Chahal's presence represented the danger that had been growing beneath that normality. There is another detail that makes the coming attack especially disturbing. Chahal was not entering an unfamiliar environment. He knew the family. He knew Rajwar. He knew where she had returned. He knew that her relatives would be around her. He knew the house. The people he encountered were therefore not random victims chosen by chance. They belonged to the world he had become angry with. The attack was personal, but its victims were broader than the original conflict. This is often what makes family massacres so difficult to understand. The offender may begin with a grievance against one person, but then anyone associated with the family. People who have never harmed the offender can become symbolic representatives of the person he blames. That appears to have happened here. Rajwar was the center of the failed marriage, but her parents had supported her. Her siblings were around her. Her sister and brother-in-law were part of the household. The younger children belonged to the same family. Ballwinder's wedding was bringing people together. In the attacker's mind, those connections may have made them part of the grievance. In reality, they were simply innocent people. That distinction cannot be repeated enough. They did not cause the separation. They did not create the violence. They did not choose the circumstances. They were targeted because they were there, because they were family, because they stood close